Enjoying your commitment to the Lord. Well, that's enjoying a commitment that we have made to Christ. And sometimes I think I've got to always say what a commitment is not. Sometimes it's easier to define something by what it isn't than by what it is. I'll get around to the positive side in just a moment, but sometimes Christianity is looked at as just simply a set of rules, a bunch of kind of regulations that are going to, snuff out the fun of life. That a person, when they say, oh, I've got to be a Christian, and all those commandments, all those things in the Old Testament, all this stuff, it's just too much. And people, I think, sometimes look at it just as a regulatory system. And that's, of course, not the way to look at it. We know better than that. But it can get that way at times, particularly if people are trying to press into new areas or trying to move into other areas of life, and they say, well, what should I do in this particular case? And they haven't really thought it through. They haven't asked too many people, so it tends sometimes to go into regulations until we can digest what's going on with the Lord in our lives. Now, of course, our commitment to the Lord really is not a commitment to a set of rules and regulations. It's a commitment to the Lord himself, a living Lord. And that commitment takes place when, of course, we realize that we're not in alignment with him, when we realize our sins, we realize our waywardness, we realize that there's a better way out there, and we make a decision. And we say, yes, I am going to allow this Jesus to operate within me and guide me and make me into a person that is better than what I came from. Now, if there's anyone here who hasn't made this kind of commitment, please see me afterwards, because it's a small step to make a lifetime of difference on the other side of that decision. And of course, once the seeds of Jesus are planted, they keep growing and growing and growing and growing, and they make us into a new person who can really become somebody that God is proud of and that we can be too, because we are fulfilled people, happy people, people that are getting something out of life, not trying to buy our way through life, not trying to find the next exciting thing through life, but people who actually find a sense of fulfillment within our lives. I believe all of you know that, because it is Christ who has drawn you here today. And so you already have these seeds growing within you. But I put it in perspective like this so that if you meet somebody who doesn't have any of these seeds growing within them, you can help them to find what you have found so far. Well, what does God ask of us? Like, how do we keep these blessings going? When the writer of Hebrews, and this writer wrote around 95 AD, and he was writing to probably second-generation Christians who were starting to forget some of the first principles that the apostles and Jesus had taught them. And he writes to them in this way that Janet read to you, like, let brotherly love continue. So it obviously wasn't continuing in the fullness of the way that it could continue in that day. And he says, look, don't neglect to show hospitality. You may be entertaining angels unawares. So there was a law of hospitality in the Old Testament, but the brotherly love business that came from Jesus said, well, look, take care of strangers. When you open your heart to strangers, God can open his heart to you. When you open your heart to strangers, then God can do something a little bit more with you, because he can give you energy and he can help you to see things that you ordinarily wouldn't see. So opening our heart to strangers is one thing, and of course the angels may be present in there. And I've talked to different people who, over the course of their lives, have talked to people and strangers, and they say, oh yeah, they walked down here, and then, gee, I didn't see them anymore. I've heard real stories. Have you heard real stories like that? Anyone? Yeah, Fred has. Yeah, some of you have. It happens. Because the angels are amongst us to help us. They're ministering spirits to help us out when we run into difficulty. And God sends them around, as he sent angels to Abraham and so on. He sends them around, and they can come in and into our situations and help us. And they can look just like you and I as other people. And this is how particularly Abraham or Jacob perceived the angels that were coming into their situations. So entertaining strangers helps us to open ourselves to the power of God. Then, of course, he moves on and he says, remember those who are in prison, as though you were in prison with them. I remember when I was a prison officer, and the day that I was on my way driving up to the prison in Australia, the particular passage in the Bible was read about visiting the prisoners, and it just occurred naturally in the readings. It wasn't concocted by the minister that I was visiting at his church service that particular day, and then they prayed over me and I went off to the prison, not to be incarcerated, by the way, but to be a prison officer in this particular place. It was an immigration prison in Australia. And I had a number of interesting experiences there, as I was able to speak to the prisoners as a Christian. And I had some very interesting exchanges with those who were not Christian in that prison. Those are stories for another day. But that experience opened me, and it opened them to a power greater than themselves. It opened them and me to the power of Christ working in that situation, and it changed these people. I could visibly see these people changed because they were hearing something different than the kind of pattern of thought that they had heard before. And Jesus changes our patterns of thought so that we begin to see and understand realities that are beyond what we would ordinarily begin to see. So that happens. He also said, and remember those who are mistreated. Well, of course, we're doing that in support of our thrift store. We're doing that in support of the many other activities, the counseling activities in this church here. And when we continue to do that, as we meet different people who have had misfortune foisted upon them for one reason or another, you can see their faces light up. And I believe you've all had that experience. I've had that experience many, many times here in this church. But this happens because the energy and the power of Christ is able to come in when we are reaching out to other people. And yes, there is some barriers. There is that, I feel a bit awkward about all of this business. But when we step out with a little bit of faith, and it doesn't take an awful lot of faith sometimes to say, how are you doing? You know, what's happening with you? Then when these things happen like this, the energy and the power of Christ can work in the situation when we become, in a sense, the hands and the feet of Christ. When we make that sacrifice, and I'll use that old-fashioned, not very interesting word, sacrifice, for a moment. When we make that sacrifice of getting over our little issues, the sacrifice of giving somebody $10, the sacrifice of giving somebody a ride home or to where they want to go, or helping an old lady across the street if she wants to go across the street, okay, stuff like that. So these things open us to the power of Christ. We also have to be very high-minded about it and be very moral, not manipulative. That's what he's getting at by let marriage be held in honor amongst all. In the ancient world, there was a tremendous level of immorality, and the pagan cults, of course, allowed just about everything and stuff you hadn't even imagined. But our Christian understanding says, no, there is boundaries out there to follow. There is boundaries that, if followed, they allow Jesus to work powerfully in our lives. So there's a moral standard in there. Now, that has to do with people. Now, what about things? He says here, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For he said, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. And then, of course, we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I've seen many, many financial things come around, and I'm going to describe a couple of them to you in just a few moments. But so we have things that we can do with people where we're focused on the Lord, and stuff we can do about things, which is usually money. Do you know, by the way, that Jesus talked about money more than he talked about the kingdom of heaven in the Bible? Because money can be such a stumbling block. So if we don't get hooked into loving money, now there's nothing wrong with being rich. Jesus and God doesn't have problems with rich people. It's how the riches are used and what your focus in your life is all about. If the riches are misused, well, then there's a problem. If the riches are always for your own self-aggrandizement and your own pleasures, then there's a big problem. But if some of the riches, not all of the riches, but if some of the riches are used to help the strangers, to help the prisoners, to help the people who are mistreated, to do honorable and right things, to uphold a moral code and boundaries to our living, then that becomes something worthy and something that money can be used for in a good way. So he says, keep yourself from loving things in this way. Love people in this way, and it'll open you to the power of God. And love things in this way, and it will open you also to the power of God. We can, of course, get sometimes a bit lazy. We can try to be lazy about our commitments to the Lord, and we can say, oh, it's just all too much. I'm just comfortable in this rut. I don't have to look outside the boundaries of where I'm sitting in this cesspool here. And God is saying, no. You've got to climb out sometimes of some of the ruts that we get ourselves into, and when we do, we're going to allow the power of God to work in our lives. And that's what I'm trying to focus on here, is enjoying this commitment to the Lord. Let me give you a couple of examples here. At our last Wednesday night meeting of Not Church, which is at 6:30, and if there's, please, I encourage you to come out and have supper with us at 6:30 and enjoy a brief church service and meet the folks that are there. There's upwards of sometimes 30 people that come out. At this last one we had, something different happened than what usually happens there. Usually, Nicole has some singing that is inspired by the events of the night, which is usually rather humorous. I talk with the people. It's a dialogical type of an interaction. There's some rather humorous and sad things sometimes that happen, but often a lot of happy things happen. But something different happened last Wednesday night. I had a few things prepared, and I asked the question, how has your commitment to the Lord paid off for you? What sort of thing has started happening in your lives? Well, the first lady, a lady got up, And I can share these with you because, of course, they were public testimonies as such. They were public little speeches they gave. But she was stung 3 times by a bee, which she usually has a pretty negative reaction, lots of swelling and lots of pain. And she was stung with this bee, and she said, really in her mind, I can't afford this medicine, and darned if I'm going to go to the doctors and do all this stuff. So she decided she was going to pray, and guess what happened? The pain went away and the swelling went down, and it was very quick. And she was on cloud 9. And as she was telling everybody in our Rose Spencer room out here. So her commitment to the Lord started to pay off in a big way. She didn't need the drugs in her case. Don't anybody go off their medication. But pray over your medication, by the way, before you take your medication so that it has the desired effect. But this lady couldn't afford the medication, so she prayed to the Lord, and He sorted her out, took the pain away, and decreased the swelling. And I'm telling you, she was literally dancing around the room. She was so happy about what God had done. She enjoyed her commitment to the Lord. It was deep, and it worked, because that's what God does in our lives. He works on our behalf. He works for us, not against us. Then there was another lady got up, and she said that there was a circumstance she was in where her landlord was trying to raise the rent. And somehow it descended into kind of a muddle and a delay and everything else. And as it turned out, she, I think, in some way prayed in this, but in some of these circumstances, it's indefinite. You're not quite sure what you're praying for, but you know you can't afford it. Anyway, as it turned out, the landlord could not legally raise the rent, and she was saved this $100 or something a month that she also could not afford. And she said, God is working in my life. God is doing something here financially to make sure that I can make ends meet. There was another lady got up, and she'd nicked a car with her car, and it had dinged the bumper on this other person's car. And the other person got out of their car and was very irate, and of course she didn't know what to do, and she had to be sat down and calmed down and everything else. And between all the exchanges that went back and forth with this circumstance is this person, the two of them went away without admitting either kind of fault, and as he went to his insurance company, it turned out to be a no-fault insurance, and she didn't have to pay from her company or have her rates raised or do it outside of the insurance companies, which is what the police advised at the time. And so she saved herself $500 just like that, and she attributed that to the work of the Lord in her life. She was enjoying her commitment to the Lord. She thanked God for the good thing that happened to her because it was very practical, very sensible. And that's what we need in our lives. Our Christian faith is not the kind of thing that is just an airy-fairy theory out there, is it? Unless our faith produces something, what good is it? It's just an airy-fairy theory. It's another philosophy. But Jesus is real, and He wants to work within us when we keep ourselves open to Jesus Himself. Now, how about a couple of biblical stories, just so that we know that this stuff is actually coming out of the Bible? The Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan in Luke's Gospel. There's a man who's going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jericho was on high land, and Jerusalem was high and Jericho was low. Usually this road between Jerusalem and Jericho was filled with robbers and problematic people, and so people traveled in groups, but for whatever reason, this man decided to go it alone. As he went along this road to Jericho, he was attacked by robbers and beaten, and his money and his possessions were stolen. Along came a priest who didn't bother to stop, who knew the rules. He knew the rule, help your neighbor, but he didn't apply it. The power of God failed that priest. A Levite came along who knew the rule, but powerless to apply the rule, and he passed by on the other side. And of course, Jesus picked a Samaritan, one of the Jewish people's kind of enemies of that day, because it's not a matter of race, color, and creed. It's a condition of the heart that makes the difference. And this Samaritan had the right attitude. And this Samaritan helped the man who was beaten, and you know the story. He took him to an inn, dressed his wounds, paid the innkeeper, said, if you have any further expenses, I'll pick them up on my way back. The power of God worked through that Samaritan man. And Jesus leveled all people with a story like that, to the people who were trying to base themselves on hierarchy and rules and all the rest of that sort of thing. So you see, this type of mentality comes right out of the Bible. There's another story. There was a widow. She went up to the offering box. It's written in Mark's Gospel, Mark chapter 12. And Jesus is watching people put money in the money box. There's a widow comes up to this money box, and she puts in a penny, everything she has to live on. Not a lot of money. And Jesus says, look, she's put more in than all these people who've given out of their abundance. Well, you see, Jesus knew that this person would be taken care of because she had given from her heart into the Lord's treasury. And that's what made the difference. That's why the writer of Hebrews can say, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have, for he said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. He never left the Good Samaritan. He never left the poor widow. And so the Samaritan and the widow could confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can people do to me? Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He was the same in AD 95 when this letter was written, and he's the same person today who still helps us and ministers and gives to us in our circumstances when we step out in his name and do something for somebody else. When we give, when we share, when we put ourselves in danger, when we take that little chance of opening our hearts and our hand to a stranger, or to a mistreated person, or to a prisoner. Just keep doing what you're already doing, and you will find that God's blessing will increase over and over and over and over and over. The widow did not love money, but God gave her so much more than money could ever buy. He gave her a life. Well, enjoy your commitment to the Lord, and really enjoy it. And as you enjoy that commitment, just keep giving as Christ has given to you. Amen. Our closing song today is, Will You Come and Follow Me? And this was a song that was written at the Iona community. And I was at the Iona community just a few weeks ago. It's over in Scotland, just off the Isle of Mull. And I'm not exactly sure the year it was written, but Iona has been going for approximately 1,500 years. A few weeks ago I commented on Iona when St. Columba Colombo went there in the year approximately 500. So I stood on the ground and on the place where this song was composed, and it was quite an experience. So when he says, "Will you come and follow me?" please continue to come and follow your Lord Jesus Christ and enjoy your commitment to him.